Welcome to BookRising, a podcast by the Radical Books Collective.
This conversation is about the book on Zionist literature, and it's one of my favorite books of the year. A little about the book. On Zionist literature is translated into English for the first time after its publication in 1967. Ghassan Kanafani's on Zionist literature makes incisive analysis of the body of literary fiction written in support of Zionist colonization of Palestine. The book is, it's wonderful, and it comes with a new preface with Annie Kanafani. And for those of you who have read Ghassan Kanafani's work, he's of course regarded as one of the finest writers and journalists of the Arab world. But sadly, so much of his nonfiction is still not available to us. One way to talk about his work is to actually use Annie Kanafani's words, where she actually says that when she first met Ghassan, she said that I felt I was confronted with an exceptional human being. And a lot of his body of work in such a way, when you're reading it for the first time in translation in English, at least for me, is that you feel like you're confronted with an incredibly rich body of work, literary and otherwise. Joining us today to Joining us today to discuss this book is Louis Allday. He's an historian and a writer. He is the founding editor of Liberated Texts. His writing has been published by Ebb Magazine, Monthly Review, Electronic Intifada, Jadaliya, and Rope Magazine, among others. He has a PhD in history, which focused on how Britain used the British Council as a tool of cultural propaganda in the Arab Gulf states. Louis, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Tell us about the series that you've edited, and tell us about why you chose Zionist literature as one of the books in the series.
Yeah, so the series is a collaboration between my website Liberated Texts, which is essentially a book review website, but not for new books that have been overlooked, neglected, or in some cases forgotten for different reasons. And obviously one of those reasons in some cases is things that were never translated into English, so didn't receive a wider audience. And so, yeah, it's a collaboration between Liberated Texts and Ebb Magazine, the publisher. And yeah, this is the first, on Zionist literature, is the first in the series. Just to be clear, it won't all be books that are kind of the first ever English translation. Some will just be republished. But from when I had the idea, both for the website and for this series, on Zionist literature was kind of at the forefront of my mind. Well, to be more exact, the fact that Kanafani's non-fiction had not been translated, or with the exception of his short article about the 36-39 revolt. Because I had begun to read his non-fiction in Arabic probably over the last 2 or so years, maybe a little bit longer. And then when I read on Zionist literature, it was partly just an instinctive thing that I just felt this has to be translated. And then when I that was about May last year, and then I realized that July of this year would be the 50th anniversary of his and his niece Lamis's killing. It just felt very appropriate to publish it in time for the 50th anniversary, and that's when it was released on July the 8th of this year. I just wanted to be very clear about something as well. I'm not the translator. Mahmoud Najib is the translator. I did work very closely with Mahmoud and did kind of get involved in the translation, but he is the translator. Sorry, so I certainly can't take credit for that. And he did an incredible job with what is not, in a number of ways, was not an easy text.
Now, I think that kind of really leads us into the next question. You talk about this not being an easy text. Tell us why this is not an easy text, and some of the challenges both you and Mahmoud faced while translating this text.
So there are many reasons. one kind of slightly more just mundane is that, as I think is in common with quite a lot of texts from that time period published in Arabic, it essentially wasn't edited. So it's actually, as brilliant as it is, it's actually, the Arabic is quite a rough text. And you almost kind of don't notice it as much on the first reading. It's only when you begin to read it with translation in mind that comes through. And also Ghassan does this thing quite often, I think, where he takes for granted a lot of knowledge on behalf of the audience at times, because he was so incredibly well informed and kind of furiously intelligent. I think sometimes his arguments are not always so easy to follow, especially in the original Arabic. And so we obviously, without taking liberties and getting rid of his voice in any way, that was something that we contended with, trying to make it obviously faithful to the original, but slightly more accessible and concise at times. And then another big difficulty, which I massively underestimated, is obviously because of the nature of the book, which is literary criticism. He references dozens and dozens and dozens of things, ranging from extremely crass Zionist novels published in the 40s and 50s, but then also Victorian novels, references much older Hebrew texts, and a real huge range of things. And we realized very quickly that actually just finding, in most cases, he was using English translations if the original language wasn't English. And obviously we had to avoid translating his translation of a text as much as possible. So what that entailed was finding everything that he quoted, and finding the original. So as much as possible, we didn't in every single case, but as much as possible, anything in this English version that you read, it's the original text that we located from whatever he was quoting, rather than a translation of his translation of what he read. And even though that was very, very problematic and time consuming and quite stressful, I think it really enriched the experience for us both, because it actually meant we had to figuratively follow his kind of literary tracks and read every single thing that he read. And obviously, and see it in context as well. And also in doing so, obviously that entailed quite a lot of research on our behalf. And in doing that, we discovered things that Ghassan himself couldn't have known at the time, but massively vindicate many elements of his argument. So even though it was more work than I had reckoned with, I think it actually made it a more rich experience. And hopefully I think it manifests in the book as well, because particularly interesting things that we located during that process of research are now all in the book in translators' notes. So yeah, I mean that gives you an idea of the kind of difficulties, and also it's I think he makes a lot of arguments, and at times the arguments are quite hard to follow. Not because of his argumentation being poor, but because it's a complex subject. And like I say, at times he does take for granted a certain level of knowledge or kind of quick pickup of comprehension on behalf of the audience. So that was a challenge as well.
The other thing that I really want to talk about is the idea of the revolutionary as a critique. Within the Western publishing world, literary criticism is seen in a very specific way. But here you have a figure like Kanafani writing literary criticism. Can you tell us a little bit more about this idea of a revolutionary as a critique?
Yeah, I mean, so it's almost not an exaggeration to say that just from reading the introduction of the original Arabic, which is probably about 2 years ago, I read it for the first time. I'd had it for a while, but I hadn't got around to reading it, and I read it. Almost within reading the introduction, I decided, like, this has to be translated. And one of the main reasons for that is he concludes his introduction by saying, I'm paraphrasing obviously, but he basically says, this book is replete with examples that contain, offensive and untrue and absurd things about Palestinians and Arabs. But generally, I don't even bother to refute them because it's taken for granted that, you know, the people I'm talking to know what he refers to throughout the book as the heart of the matter. And he says, you know, in fact, the only reason I'm reading all these things and doing this analysis is on the basis of one principle: know your enemy. And the introduction ends with that: know your enemy. And I almost got kind of goosebumps reading that, because, you know, not only did that enemy kill him 5 years after he wrote those words, but because I think it, to use his own phrase, it strikes at the heart of the matter, which is that this was not a book written out of intellectual curiosity or scholarly ambition, or, you know, kind of to fulfill a certain contract, you know, on a financial level. This was a book written by a Palestinian revolutionary, furiously trying to figure out not only, so I think, so one thing to speak to your question, he wrote this at a particularly tumultuous revolutionary time. So it's written in 1967, and it's released, and you can see if you read it, the second half is clearly written after the June War, the 67 war. So he's writing at a time of a revolutionary, tumultuous time, but also a time of defeat, a time in which in the 67 war, Israel has massively expanded territorially, is very much the victor. But not only that, it's dominated and kind of won to some extent the propaganda battle. And you can see that's what he's grappling with in that moment. How have, you know, supposed progressives in the West been propagandized to such an extent that Israel's aggression in the Six-Day War is perceived as something virtuous that they should support? Because, you know, I think obviously the broader context at this time is that large swathes of the left have been convinced or accepted that Israel is essentially a progressive force in the region, to the extent to which, for example, you know, going to work on a kibbutz is considered at that time by large elements of the left as a kind of, you know, almost socialist or progressive thing to do. So it's an enormous success of propaganda that you have people that would identify as progressive and leftist, etc., actively taking part in settler colonialist practices and perceiving themselves to be doing something good, quote unquote. So it's in that context that he's trying to basically figure out how has this happened. And also, I think another interesting thing about the moment in which the book is written is that it's written before the formation of the PFLP, in which Ghassan was instrumental. And obviously, the disaster of the Six-Day War, or the Naksa, it impacted negatively the standing and the popularity of Arab nationalism, which him and George Habash up to that point had been proponents of. And so it's written at a kind of liminal stage, I think, in his ideological development. And the PFLP was founded 1 year later. And just one further thing about, you know, the revolutionary as Critic, I think that was one of my big motivations in publishing this book, to try and begin a process of a more rounded, complete view of Kanafani in the Anglosphere, because, as you say, he was a revolutionary. He absolutely endorsed armed struggle. He endorsed armed resistance. And I think the fact that his non-fiction hasn't been translated into English has led to a slight softening, or almost kind of liberal kind of framing of Kanafani to some extent, as though kind of art is the only means of resistance. And, you know, this is not me saying that fiction does not play a role in resistance. Of course that it does. But I think you know, armed resistance and resistance through art and other means, other peaceful means, they should all be considered kind of broader constituent parts of a whole of resistance. And I think that's been lost in some kind of Palestine solidarity circles in the West, which would rarely endorse armed struggle in the way that Kanafani repeatedly and explicitly did. So it's also, as much as it's about the importance and the excellence of this book specifically, it's also about trying to encourage more translation and more engagement with his nonfiction. because obviously there's much more, and there are many other books that I could have chosen to do this, including for example, his studies of Palestinian resistance literature. But yeah, I've probably said enough.
Yeah. So you're bringing a text that was written in a very specific historical period to the present, and much has changed in that time. And of course, there is the politics of citation, and of course, the politics of language. Sometimes language itself sometimes evolves, mutates to mean something completely different, even in a small time frame. So what was it like in terms of thinking through the language that one uses? In terms of references, in terms of the politics of citations, were there specific ideas or issues that you had to keep in mind when bringing this text to the present? But again, not just framing him as the liberal framing, but really placing him in terms of his politics and ideas.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, one thing I have to admit is that there were mistakes in the references, which didn't help things. So for example, sometimes the Arabic original references a certain edition of a book, but then we got that edition and it's not on that page. So then we'd have to find another edition and realize it was on a different page. And occasionally there were just kind of errors as well. And I think that is probably that's a reflection of the fact that I think the early portion of the book is based on his work at the University of Damascus when he was studying English literature. So I think some of it was probably kind of old, and he was probably revisiting old notes, and that led to some mistakes. But then I think also more broadly, it's a reflection of the fact that he was doing this in his part-time, in evenings on the weekend. And I had the privilege of obviously I corresponded with Annie Kanafani, his widow, throughout the translation and in order to get her preface. But in Beirut in July, I had the pleasure of meeting Annie and spending many hours with her, and Ghassan's daughter Layla as well. And one thing she told me, is that not only was he doing this kind of after all his political and journalistic responsibilities and roles kind of at home where he could grab time, but it was very hard for him to get the various sources. And actually that's the sources that you mentioned, sources one, that's a very interesting question, because I found myself reading it thinking, how was he getting these sources in 60s Beirut as a stateless Palestinian who was, occasionally having to go into hiding? This was not a stable environment conducive to kind of considered literary study. So it's just like incredible that he was even able to do it. And basically she said that one of the big ways that it happened, in addition to the support from the Palestine Research Center, which by the way, I should say was the initial publisher of this book. So the PLO's research center in Beirut, the Palestine Research Center, which 10 years after Kanafani's assassination was destroyed by Israel and its entire archive looted. But I digress. Foreign friends were bringing him stuff that he needed, basically. And I just had this kind of image of this slightly chaotic, at a desk, waiting for some books to arrive for someone who's going to visit, half notes remembered from his time in University of Damascus. He was not writing, taking his time, all the time he wanted in a quiet, peaceful library or home office. He was, as you said, he was a revolutionary in chaotic, tumultuous times writing this. And that does show, to be completely honest, that does show at times in the text a little bit, and in the sources. And again, I hope that I don't want to say remedied that, but we have, where there has been specific mistakes, we have again pointed that out in translators' notes at the back. So hopefully the English text kind of, it helps. That I realize that doesn't really answer your question, but there are so many different avenues the question of sources and references can go in.
So one of the things that I really was thinking about when in one of the previous conversations today, one of the panelists talked about how sometimes the publication of Palestinian writers in translation becomes complicated, sometimes because of, at least in the United States, the refusal to publish Palestinian writers because they're considered too political. And how somehow in Britain it's just a little easier, not that it's become lotty. So you are publishing a book that is fundamentally questions of politics and existence of the Palestinian people by a revolutionary. Were there specific concerns about a project like this being derailed, or a project like this not reaching a wider audience, because you do want to bring this into a public conversation? But how does one have these public conversations, even in translation, when the politics of the public space has almost made it impossible to discuss certain kind of Palestinian texts and spaces? How do you, as both an editor, as someone who is championing these translations, how does one think through these things?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And actually, I only caught the panel immediately before ours, but I was very struck by something Sonia said about Palestinian writers always having to feel they have to tiptoe or be on the defensive, because in this book, I mean, as he did in life, Ghassan absolutely refuses to tiptoe or be on the defensive in any way whatsoever. And as Sonia said as well, it struck me when she said, I don't want to be careful. This is my life. And I think that really comes through in Kanafani's text, not in a way that makes it not kind of objective and serious analysis, but, you can feel he is grappling with something of great importance to him beyond, like I said, professional ambition or intellectual curiosity. This is him. This is his life. And that's obviously very moving and powerful. And I don't really think I've read literary criticism like that before. I mean, I think that was to go back to one of your first questions, why this book? I just remember when I read the Arabic, this thing, I've never read anything really like this before. I've now gone on such a tangent. I forgot. Oh no, yeah. So the environment. I mean, I'm not naive. Is this going to be reviewed by mainstream publications, by newspapers, by? Is it going to be stocked in kind of the mainstream book chains? Waterstones here or wherever. Is it going to kind of be one of those books put at the front of the window or No, it's not. And I think it's incumbent upon us to come up with alternative avenues. I mean, one good thing is that the way in which we publish it does get picked up by third-party sellers. So you can, for example, buy it on Barnes & Noble in the US. Is it going to be in Barnes & Noble shops? No, I don't think it's going to be. And it hasn't been reviewed massively. But I think that was to be expected, and it hasn't really stopped. It hasn't really stopped sales. I mean, we didn't really have a huge gauge on how much it would sell or not, but I'm very pleased with sales. And I know that some reviews are forthcoming, and it's been received very well on the whole. Obviously Zionists will absolutely despise this book. And in fact, I'm almost surprised there hasn't been a kind of very negative review of it in a Zionist publication, calling it, anti-Semitic ramblings. That probably will happen at some point. But again, it's about believing and knowing there is an audience there. And I think one of the big audiences I had in mind for this book, which anecdotally I know has already kind of been reading and buying and engaging with it, is diaspora Palestinians and other Arabs who, their Arabic reading ability is not fantastic, through no fault of their own growing up in the West, but are politically engaged, are aware of Kanafani and want to engage with him in a more meaningful way, especially his political work. And so it's been very, very vindicating getting messages of thanks from exactly those people. Palestinians, especially in the US, who are craving the ability to engage with his work, but just don't quite have the Arabic language ability. So yeah.
I think we're almost coming. I think we're a little over time. So I have one last question for you. Why the multiple prefaces? We have introduction with by Steven Salaita. There's Annie Kanafani. There's multiple prefaces. I'm just wondering, and there's an introduction. Was there a very specific reason why you kind of layer the introduction to the book? There's a translator's note. There's multiple. Is there a reason you layered this introduction for people?
There is, yeah. And I mean, I was conscious that there is quite a lot before the book, but just on a very practical level, the book is actually short, so I didn't think that was a problem. And basically, so the preface by Annie Kanafani, I felt very strongly about wanting that personal family involvement and the opportunity for her to say what she would like to say. Anyone who's not aware, Annie Kanafani is Ghassan Kanafani's widow, who still lives in Beirut, where they met. So I wanted that preface for that more kind of personal reflection on the compilation of the book and of Ghassan as a man. The very short initial preface by incisive of the PRC, I wanted that there because it's important to point out that this was published by the Palestine Research Center, and the importance of institutional support for Palestinians and the way in which essentially the Israelis destroyed that institutional infrastructure that the Palestinian resistance had developed in Lebanon. And Stevens, I wanted, because I wanted something that spoke about the text from now and placed it in a certain context, and it's in the current context. But also spoke about the historical context in which it was written. And then the translator's note, finally, we felt that was necessary because of the various difficulties which I've alluded to. And, I think far too often, and I'm sure many people listening would appreciate this, I think translators are not given enough credit, basically, and not given enough voice. And so I really wanted Mahmoud to have the opportunity to reflect on the process of translation and what that had engaged, and kind of, I think that sets it up nicely for how people, the combination of all those things sets the book up nicely. Whereas if it was just on its own, I'm not sure some people would engage with it in the same way.
Louis, thank you so much for this book. I actually got this book just before I went to do my own fieldwork in India, where we are right now with my dear friend Francesca Recchia. We're working on a book on India's political prisoners. And one of the things that we grappled with, and I did in particular, is to think about the language and language of resistance. And I carried this book with me, and I was reading it as we were doing the fieldwork when the book arrived. And it's just remarkable. And Bhakti will tell you how I was just, it was very important for me that we talked about this book, we championed this book, but also made sure that the series that you're editing is something that reaches more people. Thank you so much for your time. And
thank you.
The book is available and you can order it in bookstores. It's available online. And I hope a lot of you do buy this book. Thank you so much. And again, Bhakti Sringarpure for putting all of this together and making sure that we are all in conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.